There is a common misconception that wealth is built through large, visible actions, dramatic increases in income, or major financial breakthroughs. Yet when you observe how financial stability and long-term accumulation actually develop, a different pattern emerges, one that is far less visible and far more consistent, rooted not in singular events, but in repeated behaviors that operate quietly in the background. What makes these habits difficult to recognize is not their complexity, but their subtlety, because they do not produce immediate results. And without immediate results, the mind tends to overlook them, categorizing them as insignificant or routine, even though they are actively shaping future outcomes. The first of these habits is the ability to create a gap between income and spending, not occasionally, but consistently, because this gap is where accumulation begins. It does not require extreme sacrifice, nor does it depend on perfect discipline, but it does require awareness, the ability to recognize that every financial system needs surplus to function, and without surplus, there is nothing to build upon. This surplus, even if small, becomes the foundation. And over time, foundations matter more than size. Another habit that operates quietly is consistency in contribution. Many people associate progress with intensity, believing that large, infrequent efforts are what drive results. But in systems that compound, consistency tends to outperform intensity. Because each contribution is not isolated, it becomes part of a sequence. And sequences, when uninterrupted, create momentum. This is not always visible in the early stages. In fact, it often feels repetitive, almost mechanical, but beneath that repetition, a structure is forming. A third habit is the reduction of unnecessary friction. This includes things like minimizing high-interest debt, avoiding frequent financial resets, and simplifying financial systems so that fewer decisions are required over time. Friction, in this sense, is not always dramatic. It often appears in small forms, recurring costs, impulsive decisions, or inefficient structures, but collectively, these forms of friction can slow down accumulation significantly. Reducing them does not create immediate wealth, but it allows existing systems to operate more efficiently. And efficiency, over time, compounds. There is also a habit related to time horizon. People who quietly build wealth tend to operate with extended time frames, not necessarily because they are thinking decades ahead at all times, but because their decisions are not driven solely by immediate outcomes. They allow systems to run. They resist the urge to interrupt processes based on short-term fluctuations. And this restraint preserves continuity, which is essential for compounding to take effect. Another subtle habit is the tendency to reinvest rather than extract. When gains occur, whether small or moderate, there is a choice to be made between consumption and continuation. Reinvestment extends the life of the system. It feeds the base. And while the difference between reinvesting and spending may seem minor in a single instance, over multiple cycles, it becomes significant. Because each reinvested unit has the potential to generate additional units in the future. There is also an awareness of lifestyle expansion. As income increases, there is a natural inclination to adjust spending upward, and while some level of adjustment is expected, uncontrolled expansion can absorb the very surplus that allows wealth to build. Those who are quietly progressing tend to moderate this expansion, not by avoiding improvement entirely, but by ensuring that increases in income do not translate directly into equal increases in spending. This creates a widening gap, and that gap becomes a driver of accumulation. Another habit is the ability to remain within a system long enough for it to produce results. This may sound simple, but it is often overlooked. Switching strategies, changing directions, or reacting to short-term outcomes can interrupt compounding cycles, reducing their effectiveness. Stability, in this context, is not about avoiding change entirely, but about allowing time to interact with a system before making adjustments. Because without sufficient time, it is difficult to evaluate whether a system is working. And finally, there is a shift in identity. People who build wealth quietly often begin to see themselves not just as earners or spenders, but as accumulators of capital. This shift changes behavior at a fundamental level. Decisions become more aligned with long-term positioning rather than short-term satisfaction. And once this alignment occurs, many of the other habits begin to reinforce themselves. What is important to understand is that none of these habits are individually dramatic. They do not create instant transformation. They do not produce visible milestones in the short term. But together, they form a system. And systems, when given enough time, tend to produce outcomes that are greater than the sum of their parts. This is why wealth can develop quietly, because the process that builds it is not designed for visibility. It is designed for continuity. And continuity, over extended periods, often goes unnoticed until the results become large enough to be recognized. By that point, the habits are already in place. The system is already functioning. And what appears to be sudden progress is often the delayed result of consistent, quiet behavior that has been operating all along. So the question is not whether these habits create wealth immediately. It is whether they create the conditions for wealth to emerge over time. And in many cases, they do, not loudly, not quickly, but steadily, which is often the most sustainable form of growth. And when you begin to look at these habits through a wider lens, it becomes clear that their true strength does not come from any single action, but from how they interact with one another over time, forming a system that is both self-reinforcing and increasingly efficient as it evolves. Because one of the most overlooked aspects of financial behavior is that habits do not operate in isolation. They stack. They overlap. They compound in ways that are not immediately visible, and as they compound, they begin to reduce the amount of effort required to maintain progress. What initially feels like discipline gradually becomes default behavior. And once something becomes default, it no longer requires the same level of conscious energy to sustain. This transition is subtle, but it is one of the key reasons why some people appear to move forward consistently without dramatic changes in effort. The system begins to carry part of the load. There is also a deeper layer related to decision fatigue. In the early stages of managing money, every choice feels active. Should you spend or save, invest or hold, adjust or maintain? And this constant evaluation can create friction, not just financially, but mentally. But as habits solidify, many of these decisions become automated, not in a mechanical sense, but in a behavioral one. You no longer debate every option. You follow a pattern. And this reduction in decision-making creates space. Space that allows you to focus on higher-level adjustments rather than repeating foundational choices. Over time, this shift becomes significant. Because the fewer decisions you need to make repeatedly, the more stable your system becomes. And stability, in a compounding environment, is one of the most valuable attributes. It allows continuity without constant intervention. Another layer that begins to emerge is the relationship between predictability and adaptability. At first, financial systems require structure, clear rules, defined behaviors, consistent actions. But as those systems mature, they become more adaptable, not because the rules disappear, but because the foundation is strong enough to support variation. This means that occasional deviations, unexpected expenses, or changes in income do not immediately disrupt progress. The system absorbs them. And this ability to absorb variation is what allows long-term growth to continue even in imperfect conditions. Which is important because real-world financial environments are rarely stable. They fluctuate. They introduce uncertainty. And systems that rely on perfection tend to break under those conditions. But systems built on consistent habits are more resilient. They do not require ideal circumstances. They require continuity. There is also a compounding effect in awareness itself. As habits repeat, patterns become easier to recognize. You begin to see how certain actions lead to certain outcomes. You notice the relationship between behavior and result, even when the result is delayed. And this awareness improves decision-making over time, not by adding complexity, but by refining judgment. You become more selective, more intentional, and this refinement further strengthens the system. Because better decisions, even if small, compound just like capital does. Another important aspect is how these habits influence your interaction with opportunity. When financial systems are unstable, opportunities often feel risky or inaccessible because there is no buffer to absorb potential downside. But as stability increases, so does flexibility. You are able to consider options without immediate pressure. You have time to evaluate rather than react. And this changes the nature of opportunity itself. It becomes less about urgency and more about alignment. You are not chasing outcomes. You are selecting environments where your existing system can operate effectively. This is a quieter form of progress, but it is also more sustainable because it builds on what already exists rather than constantly starting over. There is also a temporal shift that happens almost unnoticed. In the beginning, most financial thinking is short-term by necessity. You focus on immediate needs, upcoming expenses, and near-term decisions. But as these habits take hold and stability increases, the time horizon begins to expand. You start to think in longer cycles, not just weeks or months, but years. And this extended perspective changes how you evaluate trade-offs. Short-term sacrifices become easier to justify when they are viewed within a larger context. And long-term benefits become more tangible because you can see the path leading toward them. This shift in time perspective is not forced. It emerges naturally from consistent behavior. And once it emerges, it reinforces the system further. Because decisions made with a longer horizon tend to align more closely with compounding structures. There is also an emotional component that becomes more stable over time. In the early stages, financial progress can feel uncertain. Small fluctuations can create disproportionate reactions. But as habits build and systems stabilize, these fluctuations become less impactful. Not because they disappear, but because they represent a smaller portion of the overall structure. This reduces volatility not just in outcomes, but in perception. You become less reactive, more measured. And this emotional stability supports better decision-making, which in turn supports the system. It becomes a reinforcing loop. Behavior supports stability. Stability supports clarity. Clarity supports behavior. And over time, this loop becomes one of the most powerful drivers of quiet wealth accumulation. It is not visible in a single moment, but across many moments, it creates a consistent upward trajectory. When viewed from the outside, this process can appear uneventful. There are no dramatic spikes, no sudden breakthroughs, just steady movement. And because it is steady, it is often overlooked. But if you extend the timeline, if you observe the same system over years rather than weeks, the difference becomes clear. The accumulation is not random. It is structured. It is the result of aligned behaviors operating over time. And this brings us back to the core idea. Wealth that builds quietly is often the result of systems that prioritize continuity over intensity, structure over reaction, and time over immediacy. These systems do not require perfect execution. They require consistent participation. And that distinction is important, because consistency is achievable in a way that perfection is not. It allows for variation, for mistakes, for adjustment, without collapsing the entire structure. Which means that progress can continue even when conditions are not ideal. And this is why these habits matter. Not because they guarantee a specific outcome, but because they create an environment where outcomes can emerge. They reduce friction. They preserve momentum. They extend time within systems that can grow. And over long enough periods, those factors tend to produce results that feel disproportionate to the effort applied in any single moment. But when you trace those results back, they are rarely the product of a single decision. They are the accumulation of many small, consistent choices, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively forming a structure that supports growth. And once that structure is in place, it does not need to be rebuilt. It needs to be maintained, which is a very different kind of task. Less about creating, more about continuing. And in systems driven by time and compounding, continuing is often where the real advantage lies.